Evening.
Hi. So we're here having this really casual conversation with all of you and Mark Rothko and art history. And in fact, tonight we thought we would focus our comments, our discussion really on Mark Rothko's engagement with the history of art. And Christopher, in your recent book of essays on your father, you had a great quote that something about your father was a radical, but that he was enamored with art history.
So my father was of a generation that many people saw as completely transforming American art and making a radical turn from everything that had happened before. And I don't think he was alone in feeling this, but he did not feel like he had made a strong break. He felt like his work was simply an evolutionary step in the history of art. He revered American art before him, and he was particularly fond of European art. He was really very focused on painting. I should say that for him, art was painting. He looked at a few other things, but every chance he got, and he didn't actually get a lot, but he went to Italy and just bathed himself in the art of the Italian Renaissance, and then back to the classical examples of Rome and Greece that he found there as well. So he never saw himself making a radical step. He saw himself ultimately extending traditions that had gone on for millennia before him.
Well, he didn't just go to Italy to look at art, right? He also went to the Met. Yes. Not that I'm promoting my place,
no bias here.
But I shifted to our first pairing since I mentioned the Met, and the Rembrandt on the right is in the Met's collection.
So yes, it's nice living in New York City, and frankly, part of the reason my father didn't get to look at art more places around the world is he never wanted to leave New York. And New York, with its amazing collections of artwork, especially at the Metropolitan, we'll put in a little plug for the Metropolitan there. It filled his world and his vision with art constantly, and I'm sure there was not a week that went by that he was not there. We have a pairing here of my father's one true self-portrait and one of many, many Rembrandt self-portraits, but it happens to be a particularly fine one, and happens to be at the Met, which he no doubt saw, and I have to believe that he was looking at when he's creating his own self-portrait. Kathy, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, you made the point when we juxtaposed the two together, and we were both so struck by the obvious similarity in palette, the sort of brown, muted background, and just the kind of the directness of the gaze, even though your father is wearing glasses, unlike Rembrandt, but there's that same power and intensity. And I love the story about your father teaching a course on contemporary art at Brooklyn College, and he began it with Rembrandt. I mean, you have to wonder what those students thought. What did they sign up for? And they're starting in the 17th century, so.
Well, but that gives you a little bit of the context of my father's vision. He loved contemporary art. He looked at contemporary art all the time, but he saw many of the forward-thinking gestures that happened in the art beforehand, the art of many centuries beforehand. And Rembrandt certainly was one of the first to, I think, really have that sort of expressionist quality, to have so much feeling that is just bursting out of his paintings. Even when they're a very dark palette, there's just subtle energy that's coming from those dark colors. The brush is so active, and the emotional energy that's coming out of his figures, particularly from the way he uses light. And my father, I think, turned to him over and over again as just a master of someone who used both light and shade, but also illuminated his figures from within.
Well, in your father's, the manuscript that you published, The Artist's Reality, he speaks repeatedly of this quality that he calls emotionality, and that it's light and then it takes form with color, but he speaks repeatedly of Rembrandt's emotionality, and that he's able to get to that essential human quality in his art, which seems to really have spoken to your father.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for the whole quest of my father's career, and we'll look in a few minutes, we'll step painting by painting, not all 3,300 of them, but we'll step painting by painting through my father's career, and we'll see how that idea develops. But really, from the beginning, he is interested in those essential human qualities. Despite the fact that he ends up painting big fuzzy rectangles, he's really painting, he's really trying to get at our most inner basic human selves, and he felt that Rembrandt was the absolute master of that. And I think it's not surprising that he turns to Rembrandt, because Rembrandt's not alone in this, but as he moves through his career and later career, his paintings get looser and looser and more abstract, and he expresses exactly that emotionality through sometimes just the smallest of gestures and really not a fully defined figure, but it's the power of the color and light coming through that still communicates that human quality.
Yeah, and even looking at the Rembrandt again and seeing the way that Rembrandt emerges from that darkness with the sort of spotlight on his forehead, the locus of his genius and creativity, but also the powerful darkness, and the idea of light emerging from darkness also very much calls to mind to me some of your father's work as well.
Absolutely, and I think we'll take that back up when we look at some of the later paintings, which a lot of my father's later paintings, not all of them, by the way, people think that all of his late paintings are black. That's not true. But we'll look at some of the later, darker paintings and see how, in fact, he tries to evoke some of those feelings of light from what's otherwise quite a dark painting.
Should we move ahead?
Sure.
Okay. You mentioned that there's a good family story that you have to go with this particular work.
Okay, so true confession. If, Layla, you're not allowed to raise your hand. If you hadn't known what the subject of this lecture is, who would have thought this was a Rothko? So, and this is probably not even quite as early as you might think. So he started painting really around 1925, and he paints almost 20 years as a figurative painter. These watercolors, we don't think are actually from right then. We actually think they're from the 30s. And he makes a couple of trips back to Portland, Oregon, where he grew up after moving from Russia/Latvia as a 10-year-old boy. And he made a couple trips back there as an adult. He hitchhiked across the country with his first wife, and they would literally camp out in the hills overlooking Portland, Oregon. And I promise you, if you go to Portland now and look at this view does not exist anymore. Portland is beautiful and green as it is. A lot of it has been built up, and this view, which really is of central Portland, is not there anymore. But he painted a series of really just lovely, sensual watercolors. And but I love the idea of this, somebody we think of as a very urban artist, and somebody who, people who knew him actually said that he never really fully shook his European roots. I just love the idea of him hitchhiking all the way from New York to Portland and just camping out in the hills because he wanted to paint this scene. He probably also didn't want to deal with his family, which is the other reason he was camping out in the hills. But I just love that. It's sort of a notion that's apart from what we usually think of my father as a very serious, very urban, very philosophical painter.
And just in case you didn't get the reference, in this work, I brought that, the Mont Sainte-Victoire, of course, by Cezanne, also at the Met, from the what can I say? Look, I'm not promoting, this looks terrible, but I'm not promoting the Met per se, but I'm thinking, you've said how much time your father spent at the Met as an artist, studying past art. So it seemed to me that if I was going to make some connections, I might as well start with what was plausible that your father actually could have seen. So, and that one just made me think of Mont Sainte-Victoire in its brushwork and its handling.
Absolutely, and I think Cezanne is definitely an influence throughout much of the 20s and 30s for him when he was painting as a figurative painter. Oh,
and again, in the Artist Reality, your father talks a lot about Cezanne and in terms of the structure in a Cezanne, and he used color, but then color as a means to structure. And your father was definitely reacting against the dissolution of form in Impressionism, and definitely seemed to be on Team Cezanne rather than on Team Monet, but in terms of his preferences. So. Shall we continue on through the jaunt? This pair, when we were talking about, I think you had sent me a couple of your father's early figurative paintings, which were, I confess, completely revelatory to me. But I was looking at the structure and composition of works where you had where there were figures in interiors, and that sense of the kind of claustrophobic, really, really tightly contained space called to mind this Fra Filippo Lippi portrait of a man and woman at a casement from about 1440, also at the Met. And then you sent me in response this painting by your father. And I think it's really interesting how even in these early figurative works of your father, you can still see what's to come in terms of the structure of the works.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great example, but by no means the only example of paintings where the figures sometimes almost seem a little lost in the painting, and he's really so much more focused on the sort of architectural pieces and the structure of the painting. I love the parallel between these two works. In both of them, you have these figures who should really be in direct relation to one another, and yet seem essentially unaware that the other one is there. I think both of them are painting their version of the human condition, perhaps. Ironically, I think you said the Filippo Lippi is a wedding portrait, right?
So they think it's because on the woman's sleeve, embroidered in seed pearls, is the word loyalty. So presumably it's a wedding portrait, but the poor groom or groom-to-be barely makes it in.
Yeah. So well, we won't necessarily dig to the bottom of that one, but. But in any case, they're inhabiting almost completely separate spaces within the same painting. Her head is her I don't know what you call it. Is that a wimple? What is it? No, a wimple is specific to a nun. I don't know what that headpiece is called. But
I don't know the Renaissance term, but
it's going out the top of the painting, which there's several of my father's paintings where the head is literally partly cut off in the figure. So again, I don't think either of these painters are so preoccupied with giving you an actual representation of the people in the painting. They're painting a scene and a condition and an interaction or lack of interaction, and it's a fascinating parallel. I don't know if he was looking at this painting. If not, too bad for him.
We just thought it made a good comparison. And then this is a view also by your father of the subway, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my father, he didn't really paint in series in this portion of his career, although later on the series are going to take over the last decade of his life. But he did make over a period of, I don't think we really know for sure, but probably between 3 and 6 years, about 12 or 15 paintings in the New York subway. And there are a couple of them that are similar in form to this one, where you have these highly elongated figures who almost disappear behind the structural elements of the subway. It's like they become one with the architectural elements. And this is during the Depression. I'm not sure if this is a comment on what the Depression and what the subway system does to its riders. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced that recently. But it is, again, striking to me how much although he's painting what's on the surface of a figurative painting, the figures seem to disappear. They don't seem to be the primary preoccupation.
And already you see the rectangles.
And the broad expanses of color. I mean, that wall, that yellowish wall stands out more than any of the figures. And
this is it the early 30s, this work, or slightly later?
This is probably mid-30s. Layli, do you remember the date on this one?
3738.
Thank you. So we have Layli Nasser here, who's on the Rothko Catalog Reze project at the National Gallery. So anytime I tell you something that's not quite right, she's there like keeping score in the corner. I'm going to get in big trouble.
Thank you. So should we move on?
Sure. So we're doing a little bit of a jump in time here, but you can see that my father has moved seemingly quite abruptly from figurative work to what's a neo-surrealist style. These are from probably 43, 44, possibly into 45. What happens in between is that my father starts to adopt some other vestiges of surrealism. He's very interested in mythic, both in myths and creating mythic work during this time. It's the same time that he is primarily writing his book of philosophical writings. He's reading a lot of Greek tragedy. He's reading Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. He's looking at a lot of mythic work from the Renaissance, and he creates his own semi-figurative but truly bizarre paintings. Sometimes they look like Greek friezes. Sometimes these are characters who are morphing into multiple characters or breaking down into different body parts. In any case, they're all based on myth. By this point, some of the paintings still have mythic titles, although these two watercolors do not. But he's moving much, much more into abstraction. And I think watercolor is actually part of what grants him the freedom to do that. I think there's something about the fluidity, literally, of the medium and how quickly the brush can move that it allows him much greater freedom in his composition. There's a lot of line drawing in this too. Almost all of them have ink elements that either underlie or are added on top of the watercolor themselves.
And the use of drawing, that's a fairly limited period in his career, isn't it, with using ink and lines in his work?
Yes, although there are points throughout this decade where, and even into the classic work, where he is creating line with the back of the brush. He's going in and scraping away at the paint to create line and those sorts of, and other sorts of drawn elements, even as he is not going in with actual ink or crayon or charcoal.
Oh, that's interesting, and his interest in this neo-surrealist phase. There was a show at MoMA in 1936 that Alfred Barr organized called "Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism," and it was a huge show with something like hundreds and hundreds of works, including cartoons by Walt Disney, but mixed in the mix were Miro and Dali and Ernst and Arp. And the next work in particular makes me feel like your father must have been thinking of Miro when he was going through this moment, like this one.
Yeah, this is so. Don't be deceived by this. This painting is actually about this big. But it is one of his most Miro-like paintings. There are others that have these elements, but he paints a lot of what feel like aquatic scenes. Some of those watercolors as well have that sort of feeling, and he makes these strange little biomorphic creatures. These are all figures on some level, but they've been clearly highly abstracted. Now we can all, I think, see what's lurking behind those figures, and it's very tempting to sort of think of him jumping from surrealism straight to painting what we think of as the color field Rothko paintings. As we'll touch on in a couple minutes, there's actually quite a bit that intervenes between there, but already we're back to those structural elements, and he's thinking as much about creating an overall, if you will, sort of landscape, although I don't want to start thinking about Rothko's as landscapes, or creating a feeling and an overall sort of color mood in the painting as much as he is depicting action on the surface.
Interesting, some of Miro's Catalan landscapes from the 1920s have that similar banded background, but his lines are more wavy. But nonetheless, he's using bands to denote in a very abstract way landscape as well. So that's another link to Miro in addition to those kind of biomorphic shapes.
Yes, indeed, and I should add that most of the European surrealists at this point, when my father's painting this, and this painting is from about 44 or 45, they're almost all in New York or somewhere in the surrounding area. They have fled Europe, and they are mostly in New York. And most of what we think of as the New York School of Painters are painting in some version of a surrealist style. So this was not something that my father did on his own. It was not something that he was seeking out. This was the art of the moment. And although I think my father departed from them in terms of the philosophy driving it, a lot of the pictorial elements are very similar. And he is, again, this is back to that point that we started with. He is trying to get at some sort of pictorial language that will allow him to connect really directly with his viewer, really hit that sort of most human element. For a while, he thought that was going to be myth. Already by this point, I think he is moving more towards abstraction as a way to get to a language that will speak to the greatest number of people most directly.
Since you mentioned moving toward abstraction, we'll move to this one.
So these paintings have come to be known as multiforms, though I don't think they were called that in his lifetime or by my father. They start in about 1946 into 47. Both of these paintings are from just a little later than that, probably 1947, maybe 48. But you can see now that he has adopted an essentially fully abstract style, and that that his color palette, we think of 50s Rothkos, classic Rothkos, as being very, very colorful and with brilliant suffused colors, and it's already here, fully 4 or 5 years before he's painting what we think of as Rothkos. He's already layering a lot of his paints. He's making bold juxtapositions of color that you wouldn't necessarily think would work, but somehow he makes them happen. And the development from here is going to be primarily formal. So between what we looked at before, the more Miro-esque painting, and these paintings, there are some transitional works where the figures that are on the background become more and more abstracted until he moves into these fully abstract works. But clearly he sees abstraction as the means that's going to get at that sort of inner core of his viewer and really speak in the most direct way possible, sort of jumping over the sort of more cognitive elements of what's going to be involved in understanding what's happening in the figurative painting and go straight to that sort of emotionality that we talked about.
These works, again, I've never seen these, and I was thinking about this particular pair last night, and I have no idea if there's any connection, and it could just be one of those formal coincidences that's all it is. But there's a painting done around 1890 by a French artist called Paul Serussier, and he was affiliated with the Nabi. And in the early 20th century, Maurice Denis, the artist, made a comment, and this was as art was moving increasingly towards more subjective and increasingly abstract. And Denis said something like, a painting is essentially, before it's anything, before it's a battle horse, before it's any subject, it's essentially a flat surface covered with color. And something about these two works called that image and that statement to mind, for what that's worth.
Yeah, no, it's funny because people think of the abstract painters of sort of stripping away the figuration, but of course any figurative painting is built up from an abstraction.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting to think about it in that way. And then, of course, that brings us next to, wait, I got ahead, sorry.
Too tempting.
There.
So these paintings are from 1948 into 1949, and this is right on the cusp of when my father moves into his classic style. And there are literally only about 10 of these works, and you can basically line them up and see him move successively to a more organized, more formally arranged, and more full and purely abstract work. It's really it's a pretty fascinating process. Both of these works are in almost any retrospective you'll see, because they tell so much about that story. So again, you have the brilliant palette of the 50s Rothkos. You have him already creating hovering rectangles. This blue one comes out and hovers in front of the other background colors, and that really primarily from the way that he sets it off in terms of the color. He's already doing a lot of those Rothko tricks in terms of layering many layers of color that shine through. If you look at the bottom of that yellow rectangle on the left, you can see that there are other yellows and reds and pinks underneath it that make it feel like not a solid object, but something that has, if you will, a soul to it. I think that's part of the reason my father's paintings speak to our emotional levels. It's like his colors are almost like our emotions. They're layered up of many layers of feeling that you experience as one thing, but are really much more complex.
Well, to your point about the layering, particularly in your works, your father's works from this period and then in the 50s, that makes me also think, too, of when he wrote about Rembrandt and talked about Rembrandt, he admired his technique and his use of glazing, these thin layers of oils to achieve translucent light effects. And I think back to that sort of sense of layering, to that very kind of classically trained artist coming out in his handling of paint in these works.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. This is not a new trick. It's simply a new trick for him, and as he actually goes on through his classic phase, he becomes people don't think of my father as a technical painter because he's painting a pretty simple form, but his technique develops in terms of how he creates the effect he creates, and it's through largely through really thinning out his paints. It's funny, we have all these receipts sitting in the warehouse, and we have just a couple receipts for paint, and we have hundreds of receipts for turpentine. So he's using so much turpentine to thin out his pigments and just create these almost watercolor-like, as you put them, glazes of paint. And those colors shine through one another. And as he goes on, and we'll see this as we get on in the 60s paintings, he's still doing that. The way his technique becomes more and more advanced is instead of doing this with 8 or 10 or 12 layers of color, he's able to just do it with 3 or 4. So it becomes, he's able to simplify and get down to those exact essentials, all he really needs to communicate what he wants to get across.
Okay, so all those turpentine receipts, are they of value to scholars studying his work? I mean, did he change turpentines, or was there anything significant, or why did he keep the receipts? I'm curious.
I think he just never really threw anything out.
Okay.
And they were typically from the hardware store. So it would just say turpentine, and the receipts we have for canvas are also, they're similarly not very descriptive about what he ordered. It just sort of says, so many yards of cotton duck, and that's it. So.
Because I know conservators especially, they always, and art historians, what kind of paint did an artist use? But I've never heard anyone ask, what kind of turpentine did an artist use? So it's kind of funny. Well, shall we move into the classic phase then?
Why not?
All right. There, now. The work on the left was the image used to advertise our conversation, but you chose that, Christopher, and I was interested, you made the comment that you chose that because it was the work that made you most think of Turner when you saw that painting, and I'd like to know why you thought that.
So I won't say that thinking of Turner was a completely random thought, although I'm happy to plug the Met, and it's Turner's too, and I happen to be a huge Turner fan, but my father was a huge Turner fan, and when he ultimately gifts a group of his murals to the Tate Gallery in London, it is largely because they were going to hang just 2 galleries away from the Clore Gallery, or the Clore Galleries at the Tate, where they have just the most magnificent Turner collection in the world, next to the Met.
No, actually, better than the Met. No, I'm not. I'm definitely better than the Met.
There's more.
There's more, and it's better. Trust me.
But I'm not sure if it fully comes across in this reproduction. From my angle right here, maybe it's not, but. There's a wispiness and a whiteness, that yellow, and the way the whiteness creeps out around that diffuse yellow rectangle that reminds me of late Turner and his skies, and you can never quite see where the sky and the land meet, where the sky and the sea meet, and what is sun and what is cloud, and that's the sort of the literal aspects of what's happening in Turner's composition. But of course, Turner is not really painting land and sky and sun and cloud anymore. He's creating a feeling state through colors and a suggestion of a landscape that evokes a great deal of emotion in us as we look at it. And I think my father is going for that same effect, and certainly in a painting like this, for me, he's evoking much of the same type of thing that Turner is after as well.
Before we do the work on the right, do you want to see the Turner that I chose in response to your comment about that Rothko?
Absolutely. Okay,
all right, we'll do that, and then we'll come back to this one. All right, this one. I chose not the Met, Turner from Tate. It's Regulus, and it's a painting that he did in 1828 and then reworked it in 1837. And by then, Turner was extremely established, extremely well known as an artist, and in fact was already coming under fire for his excessive use of yellow, sort of his dissolution of form in his work, which would increasingly happen in the next decade, in the 30s as well as the 1840s. But for this one, the light coming at the center, where he really, when he reworked it, he seems to have layered on even more chrome. He liked chrome yellow and more white paint to build up the intensity of that light. And of course, in so doing, Turner was looking back at Claude Lorrain, the great 17th century painter whose seaports Turner emulated and admired and wanted to be seen as Claude's equal in the 19th century. So for that aspect and the light, it made me think of Turner, but also Turner's, in turn, his emulation of another earlier artist and the influence that Claude had, and so much so that Turner, when he bequeathed his works to the National Gallery in London, he stipulated that his paintings hang next to Claude's seaport paintings. So that kind of art historical dialogue that Turner was engaged in the 19th century also made me think a little bit about this 20th century artistic dialogue. So that's why I chose this one.
You know, what I'm also struck by is this is not unlike some of my father's mythic paintings, where there's a myth title and there may be some sort of mythic figure, but somehow the myth seems to get subsumed by a much larger emotional quality in the painting.
No, you're absolutely right. This one, the title Regulus, alludes to a Roman general and who got taken prisoner, I think, by the Carthaginians, and they did terrible things to him, including blinding him and then forcing him to stare at the sun. So that blinding light in the center of the composition is a metaphor for that. And art historians have debated which figure in that painting is in fact Regulus in the painting, or are we the viewers Regulus? And I prefer that less literal interpretation of Turner's painting, and I think comes closer to the effect of your father's works as well.
Absolutely, and it is blinding. It's just overwhelming, the light coming at you.
So should we go back to the other one, because I like the other one too?
Okay.
Okay, that.
So this is actually one of the largest paintings my father painted. Unlike most of my father's paintings, it actually has a title. It has the very evocative title of Number 15, 1957. So this is actually a moment in his career when his palette starts to darken, and we'll see just how much it darkens in a couple of minutes. But it's still a painting that is suffused with color. It is also, it's a painting that, one of the few paintings I think that actually really communicates its massiveness. I mean, these rectangles, really, you feel their weightiness, and yet because of the way he's able to use color and because of the way he's able to feather that bottom part, it doesn't feel like they are simply weighty. It feels like despite that, they somehow float free of the canvas. And this was something that my father's playing with all throughout his career, and particularly from this point on, where he is creating something that is very much an object, and he is always insistent that he is creating something that is a real thing, and yet they belie their massiveness, and they create something for our imagination, and that somehow he's able to make these apparently very massive things float free. And I think that's again sort of I don't know if it's a metaphor for the soul, but it's something that he returns to over and over in his paintings. Something that, where if it's, we want to see it as a figure in front of the background, but it's something that belies the corporality, if you will, of the work.
Well, if you don't mind, hopefully, continuing a little more with Turner, because he plays a kind of key role in 1966. In 1966, MoMA had a Turner exhibition curated by Lawrence Gowing, and the exhibition had about 100 works by Turner, but it had its own bias, perhaps to reflect both Gowing's taste and also the fact that it was at MoMA and, say, not at the Met. And the work privileged Turner's later works from the 30s and 40s, and also more of his watercolors than his paintings. And Gowing makes a case for Turner as a precursor of 20th century abstraction, and writes an essay to go with the catalog. And it's a show that your father saw, and this is one of Turner's, this is by no means a finished painting like the work we just looked at, but rather this is one of what's called his color beginnings, where Turner would set up a composition just loosely brushing in color and with the vaguest, if any, suggestion of form, but really using color to block things out. And this is one of so-called Turner's color beginnings that your father saw and had was prompted to make a famous remark.
Oh, so when my father was in discussions with the Tate about the gift of his murals, and he mentioned that he wanted he wanted to have the paintings hang near Turner, he remarked, "Oh, that chap Turner learned a lot from me."
So, I'm sure that's exactly what, Lawrence Gowing, and I'm sure they wanted at MoMA. It's a fascinating dialogue set up at a moment and at a place where it's unexpected, but it was prescient in so many ways. Although I have to say it was, again, slightly biased because Turner didn't always paint with such abstraction, but nonetheless, that's what everyone was gravitating toward in the 1960s, and the parallels are uncanny.
Yeah, it's very striking, and I guess what's for Turner a color beginning is for my father a color ending. But I was mentioning to you today. I was looking through. I have a lovely book of Turner they call them just skyscapes, right? So it's formatted like this, and it's just watercolor after watercolor of him painting the skies, and often just very, if you want to call it impressionistically, it's quite abstract. And although he's trying to, I think he's trying to capture elements of a sky, I think it's really much more of an exercise in not in painting a sky, but in painting a composition and evoking that feeling that the skies and the colors that he's bringing to it, and also all the action and turmoil of those skies really bring to the viewer, and that he tries to capture in so many of his paintings.
Well, speaking of turmoil, two more Turners, and these were two of Turner's exhibited oils that were shown in 1843, but again were shown in Lawrence Gowing's show in 1966 at MoMA. So picture these two Turners on the walls of MoMA. And they're called, and I'm going to look at my notes because they're long titles. The work at the left is called Shade and Darkness, the Evening of the Deluge, and the other one is called Light and Color, and they're painted as a pair, in parens, Goethe's theory, and it's called The Morning After the Deluge. And in both of the works, and particularly the one on the right, you see Turner's signature vortex, that vortex of light, of water, of air, of energy that really comes to define his painting. And Christopher, you've written about a sense of movement in your father's paintings as well, and I think it's something that when I thought about your father's work, that wouldn't have been the first word to come to mind when I would think of describing a Rothko.
Yeah, people tend to focus on the more meditative quality of the paintings, but particularly the 50s paintings, and then it actually reappears at the very end of his career. There's very active brush work, and there are very turbulent areas in the way he applies the paint, particularly around the edges of the rectangles. There are often places where multiple different colors are not just peeking out, but really in sort of sharp contrast with one another. And there's a tremendous amount of energy, both in terms of the way the colors interact, but also in terms of the way the brushwork comes out. He also created movement through color itself. And I'm just reminded of a story where a collector had come to him in the 60s and my father brought out a very dark painting for them. And she said, no, I want one of the nice light-colored ones from the 50s. And he said, well, don't you see the violence in that painting? And she goes, no. He goes, well, it's red and yellow. Isn't that the color of the Inferno? So he was always very insistent that even those sunniest looking and sometimes very on the surface plastic looking paintings, there's a lot of energy under there, and it's not. And it's often a violent sort of primordial energy. He's trying to capture that feeling, much as you will see in these Turner skies, of really powerful elemental forces.
Well, one of the a sentence in Gowing's essay accompanying that exhibition struck me because he was directly linking Turner with what contemporary artists were doing, and I'd like to share it with you because it made me also think of an aspect of your father's work where it might also connect him to Turner too. He said, Robert Motherwell has spoken perceptively of the tragic quality in Turner's art, which painting seeks again now. So in Turner, the quality is perhaps as truly called heroic. And that idea of tragic and thinking about and the drama and thinking about what you've said and what your father has said about his own art struck me.
So when my father's working on his book of philosophical writings, he's reading a lot of Greek drama, and as I say, he's reading Nietzsche as well, and he's very, very focused on on how the Greeks are able to capture those most elemental moments in human life, those essential sort of existential questions that most of Greek drama, or at least the tragedies, I should say, focus on that. And he felt that those elements in the sort of tragic elements are the most essential ones that really define our lives, the rites of passage, and even as we are focusing on birth, we are focusing on death. There are always sort of those ultimate ends there. So those are the qualities he always wants to capture at his paintings. Even as he's talking about joy, there is always the memory of ultimate undoing. So I think those are some of the elements that Turner evokes in a painting like this, and that he always has underneath the surface of his paintings as well. Some of them quite literally in those surrealist works, and then still percolating in the abstract works.
One more Turner-Rothko comparison, and unusually the work on the left, the Turner with the black. And the black is there for a symbolic reason, in that in this canvas from 1842, Turner is painting the burial at sea of his, I'd say, frenemy, the artist David Wilkie. And Turner was critiqued for the black being not naturalistic. And he's reported to have commented something like, if I could have had any black to make it any blacker, I would have done so. And juxtaposed with a darker work by your fathers as well, I thought made an interesting conversation.
Any of you who saw the exhibition at Pace Gallery last year, the Dark Palette exhibition, this painting was there, and I actually have to say it has never looked better than it did in that place. It is really a couple shades darker than what you see here. It's impossible to photograph. It's also impossible to light in a gallery. But it is three different blacks, and they're different not so much in their hue, but in their reflectivity on a brown about 3 shades darker than that. It is just it's like a 85% cocoa solids, dark chocolate. And yet if you look at it and you spend time with it, it doesn't really feel like a dark painting. The light inside it, both through the reflectivity of the black and the subtle color in that background, end up seeping through. So as he is exploring the darkness, he also always has that element of light, and certainly in the Turner painting, that black is dominating, and it's quite overpowering, and indeed it's not naturalistic. It's a big blot and shadow in the middle of the painting, but it's in the context of a great deal of light around it.
Absolutely. So that element of hope is present as well amidst the darkness. That's fun. Let's see where I think if we had any more thoughts, I pulled in one more Rembrandt. I don't know if you want to say anything more about Rembrandt, and since we're talking about light, dark, chiaroscuro, I don't know if there's further thoughts.
Well, this is a painting my father. I don't know. Is this at the Met?
It is.
Oh, how about that?
Is.
Is that the?
How about that?
It's funny. I don't remember it being at the Met. I clearly have to go back tomorrow.
Oh God! When did this came to the Met? Actually, in 1961. Aristotle with a bust of Homer.
Well, I haven't been to the Met since 1960, so that would explain it. So.
I don't believe you.
But again, I think this is very much the type of Rembrandt painting that would inspire my father, and where he's just able to take just the sort of delve into the darkness and still find color there, but always have that little bit of light of hope. And again, in almost all of the darkest paintings, there's some little element of color or some just little hint of white that somehow makes it not truly a dark painting.
And this work has a profoundly meditative quality as well. I mean, it's figurative, but I think your father's works have the same.
It's figurative, but you actually have to work pretty hard to see the figure.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, emerging
Yes.
from the darkness. Absolutely. Let's see where we're going next. This one, another Met painting, obviously not Rembrandt, Vermeer. And I don't know if your father or anybody else has ever spoken of Vermeer in connection with your father's work, but there was something about, well, first of all, the light, and their shared interest in light and color, and a kind of stillness, but also a sort of structure and a kind of sense of containment, similar to what we saw in the figure paintings, that your father's earlier figure paintings, where those figures are sort of locked in spaces. I sense the same thing when I look at her, this woman at her toilette, sort of locked into that interior scene. And I don't know if there's anything in that or not, but I'm just putting it out there.
Yeah, I remember when you first mentioned this painting and how much struck you were by it, and I think as you're talking about that structural element, and it is, I mean, it's such a composed picture. Everything has its place, and it's very carefully laid out. And I think that's something that you do see in my father's paintings. I think we're often very inclined to move to that sort of romantic element, that strong feeling element in my father's work. And he does absolutely pull for that. He looks to have that sort of romantic expressivity, but it's done through actually very sort of classical formal means. And you obviously see that in the very structured classic paintings, but we saw it also in those earlier paintings where even then he's looking at those more formal elements and how do you organize the painting. And when we did that little step through from the Surrealist paintings to the multiforms to the transitional to the classic paintings, and by the way, that all happens in just about a 4 or 5 year period. What's really happening, the color's not changing, and even the way he's applying the paint for the most part is not changing. It's the structure. He's tightening up the structure and making it more and more formally arranged.
Well, then I think maybe they would have been kindred spirits had they met. For complete change, this work by Matisse, The Red Studio from 1911, MoMA acquired it in 1949, and I understand your father spent days and days on end going there to visit this painting.
Yeah, my father literally lived down the street from MoMA at this time, and my understanding is that he went to go look at it every single day for an extended period of time. I think he essentially went into color shock. I think he was overwhelmed, as many viewers were, by Matisse's daring at just saturating a painting with a single color, and again, to the point where the figurative elements almost drop away. They're there to create some structure and some elements of movement, but really you come away with just red. And I think it's part of what allowed him the boldness right around this same time that this painting appears at MoMA to finally just say, I'm going to just cover a canvas in a couple of colors and just boldly say it as directly as I can, really express those human elements I've been looking to express for so long. I think this gives him some of the courage to simply just do it as simply and directly as he can.
And then he paints one of his few paintings, and he titled it. It was his title, or did someone give it the title, that Homage to Matisse from 1954? Was that his title?
That's his title. It's one of his very, very few paintings. It's really that I can think of, his only painting from his classic period that bears a title rather than a number or a bunch of color descriptors that were usually put on by somebody else after the fact.
Does it have red? I can't remember.
No, actually it does not. It does not have, I mean, it has red-ish elements, but it's not primarily a red painting.
That's interesting. So, Matisse.
So apparently he looked at a couple of other paintings as well. But.
I guess so. Shifting gears now to, we've already brought up the Seagram Murals, and this is a shot of the installation at Tate and one of the works. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this, but I thought that this could launch our discussion also of the Sublime a bit.
Certainly. So my father painted this group of murals originally to go in a private dining room at the Four Seasons restaurant. He was commissioned by Philip Johnston, who was designing that portion of the building. And it's a relatively famous story, and if you've seen the play Red, you get much of that story not too distorted. It's a commission he ultimately withdraws from because he realizes that a dining room is not going to be a place that is really going to allow him to have the interaction with his viewer he's looking for. But as he's working through those questions, he is first of all thinking about having a room that is just his artwork in it, and having viewers who are sitting there for an extended period of time. And so rather than trying to paint something that is going to catch your eye on the wall as you walk through a museum, He's painting something that is going to seep into you over a 2 or 3 hour dinner. And he is realizing that he is going to basically take over the entire walls in this room. And so he's creating paintings, and this is back to that structural architectural element that we saw earlier. He's painting works that essentially are almost like pillars holding up the ceiling, and they are serving that kind of function on the walls, so they almost become the walls of the room. And when he makes his gift to the Tate, he knows the room that is going to be that they're going to be in, and he ends up painting over 30 paintings for that original commission, many more than would actually have been installed. And he selects from those 30, I think it's actually 33 or 34 paintings, depending on how you count them, selects a group of 9 for that room, and again makes the installation that is going to envelop you and is going to be a sort of a slow burn conversation rather than something that is going to grab you immediately by the shirt collar.
And these were, just a reminder, these were the works that he wanted to hang near Turner's.
That's correct, and did hang near the Turners for, more than 20 years, until they built the Tate Modern, and then they got hijacked across the Thames. And I completely understood why the Tate did that, and what we think of as, or I think of as the Tate is now the Tate Britain. So they made a different division, but part of my father's soul is still pining to be back across the Thames next to the Turners.
Yeah, in fact, I was just at Tate Modern last fall and walking around, and I came upon the Seagram Murals, and immediately, I don't know if you've been there recently, but when I was there last September, immediately in the gallery before them is a Monet water lily panel, which is, it's really interesting to see that in that context, and then you go into the dimmed gallery and experience the Rothkos. It's a different experience, but more on Monet in a bit.
Okay.
But for now, there's one other, this horizontal Seagram mural too. Thinking about, I know that your father said his paintings aren't landscapes, but using the scale of this and the horizontality to sort of start in on to talk about this idea of the sublime, and particularly Robert Rosenblum's 1961 article that he coined the term abstract sublime in response to the work of Rothko and his fellow abstract expressionists, conjuring the 18th century notion of the sublime experience of nature as infinite and awe-inspiring and fear-inspiring and terror-inspiring and somehow so powerful, and likening and seeing a continuum between Friedrich in the early 19th century and Turner to Rothko, Still, Newman in the mid-20th century. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I certainly think that my father's large classic canvases are striving for that same element, for things larger than ourselves, for elemental forces, and he makes his paintings during the 50s into the 60s grow larger and larger, and they tend to become more horizontal, as if he wants to cover your entire field of vision. And he's looking for you to lose yourself in painting, in these paintings, much as I think Turner or Friedrich are having you lose yourself in nature, lose yourself in the landscape, and are also often painting quite large paintings where you see these elemental forces that sweep you up in a certain emotionality, and again in a sense that they're of sort of an awe-inspiring place that is again greater than the viewer.
I'm going to switch to the Friedrich. That actually in Rosenblum's 1961 article, this is the work that he uses to illustrate the notion of the sublime in the 19th century and then link it to the 21st century. And if I can read, and I don't know, it's really dark in here. Is there a sort of mid-level light range, or is this what we have? Is this what we have?
I can get up my
Oh, wait,
phone.
this is, oh God, thank you, this helps. Just bear with me, because if you don't mind, there's this beautiful quote that from Robert Rosenblum in 1961, written in response to this work into your father's work, and I just think it's worth sharing in terms of the sublime, and I could never put it any better than Robert Rosenblum. So if you don't mind to share. He wrote, in the abstract language of Rothko, so I'll switch back to Rothko, he said, we ourselves are the monk by the sea, standing silently and contemplatively before these huge and soundless pictures, as if we were looking at a sunlit or moonlit night. Like the mystic trinity of sky, water, and earth that in Friedrich and Turner appears to emanate from one unseen source, the floating horizontal tiers of veiled light in the Rothko seem to conceal a total remote presence that we can only intuit and never fully grasp. These infinite glowing voids carry us beyond reason to the sublime. We can only submit to them in an act of faith and let ourselves be absorbed into their radiant depths. So that.
Beautifully put. And it's amazing that he's writing that in 1961. So he's writing this about the Abstract Expressionist school, which, I mean, it's the Abstract Expressionists have been known and discovered by that point, but this is really very early to have that vantage point and not merely see it as an American school of painting that's a radical departure of what came before, but really tying it back to another school of painting and this romantic tradition. If we can go back to the Friedrich, I think, and maybe the lights can come back down so we can appreciate the Friedrich a little more. I mean, this is, again, that very romantic notion of the solitary figure, sort of, if you will, sort of heroically facing the unknown, but also I think you have a sense of indeterminacy and uncertainty, right? What can, is this something that we can face up to? Is this a place where we can, in fact, if mankind can begin to understand the great beyond and the vastness. I think the next Rothko painting, if anything, captures some of that feeling as well, that feeling of indeterminacy.
That one?
Yes, and this is a rather Turner-like or Friedrich-like sky where that white has so many levels of white and so many, it just invites you in, but it's not clear that you're ever going to find clarity there. There's not, it's a place, it's a space that invites contemplation, but not necessarily answers. So, and I think that's part of that whole romantic notion, is that you're on a sort of quest, but the quest is part of, is perhaps the answer in of itself. That search for knowledge, that search for understanding is the answer, because there isn't necessarily going to be a concrete answer at the end.
Yeah, it's that unknowability that also makes something sublime as well.
Absolutely.
And I love when you sent me this image, you captioned the email, you gave it your own title, which I really liked. You called it Rothko Lost in Turner's Clouds. And I love that. I think that's really evocative. And also, I came across a description of Turner written by a contemporary artist, Charles Leslie. Leslie described Turner as the painter of light, air, and space. But to my mind, that could easily just as well have applied to Rothko.
I couldn't agree. I'm not going to say anything more than other than that. I agree.
No, I just thought, wow, it's powerful.
Yes.
And also the way that people talked about Turner in the 19th century, he was increasingly criticized for this dissolution of form and this indistinctness in his painting. And a critic in 1816 said about Turner, but again, words that I think and might have been said about your father's art as well, all is without form and void. Someone said of his landscapes that they were pictures of nothing and the very like. And that idea of pictures of nothing, isn't that something that your father reacted against when someone said something like that about his own painting?
Absolutely. My father was always insistent that his paintings were filled with content. They were not about nothingness. But there is an indeterminacy. And, the quote you just read about Turner sounded to me like the ultimate compliment. But I think for both of them, they are asking those unanswerable questions. They find that the truth is very much, or the important questions to ask are in that search for the unknowable, the things that are just beyond our grasp, and that is really the most worthwhile process for mankind, is to grasp with the ungraspable, if you will, or grasp for the ungraspable.
Well, I think that's the perfect segue then to Rothko Chapel as well.
So any of you who have been to Houston, I hope you have been to the Rothko Chapel. This is really my father's magnum opus. He's commissioned in 1964 by the Devonneal family to create what's initially going to be actually a Catholic chapel, ends up becoming a completely ecumenical chapel, explicitly open to all faiths. And they have, by the way, no idea what he's going to paint. He doesn't really just create the murals that are there. There are 14 large murals. But he, in fact, creates most of the space in conjunction with Philip Johnson, but he is the one who dictates the octagonal form, the skylight, the skylighted space, and the simplicity of the flooring and the pattern. Everything that Johnson suggests as an additional element, my father insists on taking away to the point where Johnson can't take it anymore and leaves himself. But actually, Johnson was extremely generous and essentially letting my father do what he wanted with the space. And it really is one work of art, not 14 paintings in a building. That building and those paintings are one thing. And it is really not a group of paintings. It is an experience. You go there to deal with exactly those sorts of questions that we've been discussing, those questions that we're always asking ourselves whether we know it or not, and the ones that we usually don't have time to really think about very seriously. Well, you go to the Rothko Chapel, and if you allow yourself to walk in and sit down, time essentially stops, and there's really nothing left but those sorts of questions.
Well, I love how you said that it's something to be experienced alone, the Rothko Chapel.
Yeah, I guess my catchphrase for this is the Rothko Chapel is a great place to go with some people you know and be alone together. Because although it is explicitly a space that welcomes everyone and is open to everyone, it is a place that ultimately I think your journey is a solitary one.
There's one more view of the interior, and I'm noticing that we're running.
Are you running short on time?
No, we're just running up to about an hour. But I thought, do you want to we'll do our sort of speed dating at the end with sort of influences of?
Oh, we can just simply say this is another version
Yeah.
with one of the triptychs with the raised central panel.
Okay. And then just thinking about that notion of interior and enveloping interior, I know I mentioned that I was not shocked, but it was unexpected to encounter Rothko and Monet almost side by side at Tate Modern last fall. But then it got me to thinking that, well, of course, on the surface they seem so dissimilar, but Monet too, especially late in his life, was after a similar immersive enveloping experience. And when he painted the water lilies for the Orangerie in Paris, these two rooms were made to his specifications for these works. And Monet in the 20th century was very different than Monet in the 19th century. And in 1908, he made a comment, I'm now seeking to paint what I feel. And I think that really aligns him with Rothko. And also of interest to me too was the rediscovery of late Monet in the mid-1950s in New York when MoMA bought a water lily in 1955. And that actually had the effect of jump-starting the careers of some of the abstract expressionists too, linking them with Monet and vice versa. So I just think it makes for an interesting synergy to think about that.
Absolutely. Painting that is not simply about what you see with your eyes. And again, he's
Right.
very much thinking about how his viewer interacts with the work, which is always my father's preoccupation. So I think of this as an incredibly modern installation.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my Monet-Rothko moment. But just by way of wrapping up, we thought we would look at a few artists and kind of speed date through thinking about Rothko's legacy.
Okay. Maybe we'll skip over the next one, which is a couple of Rothkos.
Okay. Here. This Rothko at the left was the first Rothko to enter MoMA's collection in the 50s.
You actually belonged to Philip Johnson, ironically enough.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, why did he part with it in 52?
I actually don't know what the story is with that, although clearly he thought that MoMA should have a Rothko.
Well, that was good of him, because meanwhile then Robert Ryman is a guard at MoMA, spending years there and apparently having a lot of time to commune with your father's art, so hence the Ryman-Rothko juxtaposition here.
And I think Ryman really is somebody who is someone who is inheritor of my father's legacy, someone who continues in some of the same veins, not simply because he's painting very simple canvases, but because there is in the whiteness of his whites, there's a real sensuality. These are not blanks on the page. These are the way he paints them, whether they are textured, whether they are layered, he is evoking that sort of sensual experience that my father was, also again with very simple means. And this is in a way that I think that I'm always not inclined to lump him in with people who are sort of seen as minimalists, because I feel like there's ultimately an emotionality to his work that comes through, and also asking some of those same questions about sort of ultimate causes as well, and poking around in that area of the sublime.
And he spoke of being struck by the presence of your father's paintings and the way that they interacted with the light. So I think that's an interesting connection. All right, so zooming on, perhaps unexpectedly, Hiroshi Sugimoto photograph, and you mentioned a take on that in your book on your father's art.
Yeah, I mean, Sugimoto has a number of well-known images, but he has a whole series of photographs of movie screens, blank movie screens, and what I find fascinating with these is the expectation that he sets up, because a movie screen is not simply it's not. Let me back up a second. So, first of all, he I think intuits, like my father does, that the screen is essentially what we see with our eyes. The shape that is presented there, it's not an accident that screens are the shape they are. It's not an accident that late Rothkos tend to be very horizontal. He is, again, enveloping us or taking up our whole field of vision with a screen. But then I think he sends us into a little bit of an existential panic, because screens in our experience are to be filled, right? And he's suggesting that there may be a void here. And that's something that I think my father is playing with throughout the late part of his career, where he presents us with nearly a void, particularly in the Rothko Chapel, and then really demands that the viewer be the one to fill it up.
And then finally, a selection of James Turrell, who famously, invoked not only your father's work, but also Turner in talking about light, saying other artists are, trying to capture light, but my art is light. And he literally is using light, but to some of the same ends that your father used light in his paintings as well.
Absolutely, and he's creating structure and he's creating movement through light in almost all of his works. And there's also a real sensuality in the way he uses color.
Oh, yeah. And it's something like At and Rain, I mean, that was truly a sublime experience, to experience the Guggenheim Rotunda in that way in 2013. And just a couple more, because there were this chapel in Berlin, and then this one, which I was mentioning to you, and the installation that recently opened at Mass MoCA. This one seemed to me that he was definitely channeling Rothko.
Yes, and not just in the shape and in the color, but again in an object that moves because of the way he's using color and light.
Yeah, that's true. The vibrating.
The vibrating and how
Yeah.
it seems to come out towards you.
And finally, this.
That's my favorite Rothko.